It's Office Hours Live!
Ah!
Is that scary? Is this scary?
Yes.
You know, I tried this last night, and nobody gave me any candy. Anyway, we are 1 week away from perhaps the most significant election in recent memory. And what I would like to do is talk to you. Oh, by the way, this is Office Hours Live. You're live, I'm live. Dolly Parton still hasn't phoned in. I don't know why. Make sure other people know that we're on live. Share this so that we can all be on live together. We can all be alive together. Today, we're going to talk about, before I take your questions, and before we have a special guest, Karen Martin. The wonderful, inimitable Karen Martin is going to be joining us to talk about voter suppression. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. The latest polls are showing the race narrowing dramatically. A lot of it has to do with enthusiasm. And Hillary Clinton does have, or at least appears to have, a little bit of an enthusiasm gap, or more of an enthusiasm gap with Donald Trump. Nothing, I don't think, to be terribly concerned about, in the sense that, the polls have shown for the entire general election that she has led Donald Trump by 8 points to, and at the lowest, 2 points. I mean, it's been 2 points to 8 points all along. And it goes up and down, depending upon the news and the particular polls. And the polls, by the way, are not entirely consistent. But what you can take away from this is that the race does, right now, appear to be narrowing. And unfortunately, it is just a week before the election, which means it's very important for you, and everybody you know, to be voting. Make sure you vote. James Comey. James Comey, as you know, kind of threw a wrench into this election on Friday. How's it? Wait a minute, maybe he has a little bit more hair. Because obviously he, without really knowing very much, I mean, what happened was they found some emails on Anthony Weiner's laptop, and there was no indication that those emails have really anything directly to do with Hillary Clinton's emails, but perhaps in an overabundance of caution, what happened was essentially James Comey wrote to Congress and said there may be some relevance, and all hell broke loose. Now, there is a serious question here about his judgment in doing this just 10 days, 9 days, 8 days before the election. This is not really what an FBI director is supposed to do on the basis of no evidence. Remember, there was no warrant. They did not review the emails. They don't know the emails even have anything to do with Hillary Clinton. They don't know that the emails, even if they do have something to do with Hillary Clinton, have not already been looked over. They may be the same emails that the FBI has already seen. So there's no indication here that there's anything relevant. But what the FBI director, James Comey, did is he threw a monkey wrench into the whole election, because a lot of people say, well, this means that the email case is reopened. It's not officially reopened, but it looks that way. And why is it? Well, I mean, we have some evidence. CNBC reported that James Comey, in early October 7th, made a decision that he was not going to publicly announce anything about the Russian connection with regard to a finding of hacking by Russia, and was not going to even necessarily say anything, in fact, certainly was not going to say anything about Donald Trump and any possible connections the FBI might be looking into with regard to Trump and the Russian connection. So why? Because according to CNBC, James Comey felt, and the FBI felt, it was too close to the election. So this naturally creates some question about what's going on here. And I'll tell you what worries me, frankly, is not only the question of bad judgment with regard to James Comey, but also, naturally, the Clinton campaign is questioning his integrity. There are rumors. I mean, certainly Harry Reid says maybe James Comey is acting criminally. All of this, combined with Donald Trump's allegation that the election is fixed in the other direction, reduces the public's confidence in our entire system. I want you to remember that. I mean, there is no reason right now to suspect that James Comey is doing anything other than exercising what I consider to be very bad judgment. There's no basis for assuming that he is violating the Hatch Act or acting in a criminal way right now. And the more one campaign or the other gets into this accusation game, even though, again, very, very bad judgment. Can we be very, very clear? Bad judgment. But the more we get into the accusation game, the more confidence in government continues to decline in this country. A very, very big issue. Let me also say, in terms of confidence in government declining, I wish the Obama administration and the Army Corps of Engineers, part of the Obama administration, would just stop the pipeline, the Dakota Access Pipeline, permanently. There's no reason to keep that pipeline going. I mean, we know that it is being built very, very close to Sioux Indian territory. There are possible problems there, not only with regard to the burial sites of the tribe, but also the pipeline. I mean, we know, for example, since 1995, there have been over 2,000 significant oil pipeline accidents in the United States. And that tribe depends on water coming from the Missouri River through that area and filtered through that area. If something happens with that pipeline, that tribe is not going to have any water at all. And we know also that there are diseases, all sorts of diseases associated with those pipeline spills. And there's been a lot of research about this. So from a standpoint of public health, from the standpoint of just fairness, if not considerations of the religious traditions of that tribe, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Obama administration should simply halt it, period. All right? And your questions. I want to get to your questions because Karen is going to be coming in and joining us. Jian Yan, could you please talk about the potential for voter intimidation in swing states? Yes, Jian, there is a big potential for voter intimidation in swing states, partly because the Justice Department this year has decided not to send out its 32,000 voter monitors as it did in 2012. Why not this year? Because the Shelby versus Holder decision by the Supreme Court basically gutted the Voting Rights Act, removing the justification and the rationale and the authority of the FBI and the Justice Department for setting in, not the FBI, the Justice Department for sending in those monitors. And meanwhile, you have Donald Trump asking his followers to go out into certain places. Well, we know what that code word "certain places" is. Those are places where you have a lot of minority voters. And act as monitors, as self-appointed monitors. Chris Connolly, is there a risk that polls are under-reflecting Trump support as some people intending to vote for him in the privacy of the booth don't want to be branded deplorable by voicing their intent semi-publicly to a poll taker? I'm having a Brexit flashback in that regard. Chris, you are right to be a little bit concerned about Brexit, and also remember the vote in Colombia. The polls showed that most people in Colombia were in favor of that FARC agreement, and it turned out they weren't, because they were a little bit shy, a little bit embarrassed to tell pollsters that they were against it. So there is always that possibility. Take nothing for granted, and don't be complacent about this election. Barbara Kerwin, can we talk about Trump's hidden connections to Russia and why we don't know the story yet? Barbara, we know that Donald Trump's major staffers, up until very recently, they were on the payroll of some major figures in Russia. One was doing public relations for Putin at the same time that he was doing public relations for Trump. We also know with a high degree of probability, we don't know for certain, that Trump has borrowed a lot of money, must have borrowed it from some Russian oligarchs. Again, this is conjecture, but you know, the banks in the United States are not lending to Donald Trump because he's not a very good credit risk. So you put all of that together, and why isn't there an FBI investigation of that possibility? Remember, Donald Trump told the Russians to hack. Remember, he said, why don't you get information about the emails, about Hillary's emails. So I think it's not unlikely that there's some Russian connection. Cynthia Ayers, how serious in your mind is the fact that Donna Brazile leaked debate questions to the Clinton campaign and was let go by CNN for doing so? Cynthia, it worries me for the same reason that I'm worried about a lot of what's happening in this election. This kind of, it undermines confidence in the entire process. If you've got somebody, and I know Donna Brazile, and I've been, I've worked with her before, and I like her very much, but if she's leaking questions to the Clinton campaign before the presidential debates, that's just another instance. It's like Debbie Wasserman Schultz and the Democratic Committee, National Democratic Committee. It's just another piece of evidence in this entire lattice work, and you have a lot more on the Trump side. That undermines what people feel should be a government system that works well. Melissa Kandaraja, did I pronounce that right, Melissa? In regards to an optional healthcare system, is there any chance for a single payer in the U.S., or is it never going to happen? Melissa, the president is now coming around to thinking that maybe a single payer, or not a single payer, a public option, which may be a step toward a single payer, is necessary. Hillary Clinton has also come out in favor of a public option. And I think that we are almost invariably going to have to move to a single payer system. And I say that only because there's no way we can continue in the direction we are going right now. Some of the biggest insurers, they are getting together. They are monopolizing the insurance market. That's what their intent is. They are merging like mad. Meanwhile, healthcare costs are now 18% of the entire economy, and they are continuing to head upward. And co-payments and deductibles for everybody are going up. We cannot any longer maintain and sustain the path we are on. And we've got to do what almost every other industrialized country has done, and that is be sensible and have a single payer system. Kim Abri Lyman, please tell me if the president can actually cancel existing student debt and your opinion on its impacts on the economy. Kim, the president could, because most of that student debt is held now by the government. And by executive order, in my view, the president could cancel it, and I think the president should. I think that it's a huge drag on the economy. And not only is it a drag on the economy, it is a terrible impediment to many of these young people. I believe we should work as fast as we can toward a system of free public higher education. Public higher education is not a private investment. It is a public good. Do you agree? Jeff Haas, what are your thoughts on a new 2x4 program in America? In exchange for 2 years of service to your country, you get a 4-year college education for free. Jeff, I think it's an excellent idea, but as I said just a moment ago, I think we ought to be moving toward a 4-year free public higher education. We were almost there, in the 1960s. Here at the University of California, Berkeley, tuition was about $87 per semester. And before that, there was the GI Bill. We had a whole generation of returning veterans who got free college education. Was that bad for America? No. Could we afford it? Yes. In fact, it generated it contributed to the extraordinary economic growth of the 1950s and 1960s. Ramona Leonard Supernant. That's a name. That's a great name. All I ever want to talk about these days is how important it is to have a Democratic majority in the House and Senate. Well, I take it that's your question, Ramona, and I agree. I mean, I doubt very much we're going to have a Democratic majority in the House. It's going to be too hard to do. There are too many of those seats that are safe because of gerrymandering. But in the Senate, I think it is likely that the Democrats will gain at least 4 seats. Now, if Hillary Clinton is president, all the Democrats need are 4 seats, and then the Democrats have a majority in the Senate. Next question, Sheila Amarzozi. If Hillary wins by a small margin, won't Trump contest the election and how long could that go on? I think that Trump is going to contest the election in any event, but of course if she wins by a very small margin, that's going to make his supporters even more vehement about their opposition to her presidency, and give him more reason in his mind and in the minds of his followers to question the legitimacy of her presidency. And I wouldn't be surprised if he tried all sorts of challenges, but again, there is a difference, and I want to draw a distinction in your minds between challenging a particular vote in a particular place because there is reason to believe that there was something wrong with the vote, like the Chads in Florida. You remember the hanging Chads in 2000. On the one hand, and on the other hand, just condemning the entire vote and saying there has been widespread fraud, having no evidence at all, and demanding recounts. That would be irresponsible, but I'm afraid Donald Trump will do that regardless. I mean, every time I say Donald Trump might do something that is irresponsible, he turns around and does it. Justin Conkling, do you think our country will only split even further in the future? Justin, I honestly don't think so. I take every opportunity I get as I travel around the country to find people who call themselves Republicans or Tea Partiers, and even Trump supporters, and I ask them about what they believe and why they believe it, and I am continually struck by the fact that most Americans want the same thing. We may want it for different, we may think of the means as different in terms of getting to the goals, and we may have different values, particularly with regard to issues that have to do with religion or abortion or gay marriage. But when it comes to the economy, when it comes to this country, when it comes to our place in the world, most people feel exactly the same or very close to the same. And I think it's wrong to assume that these differences are just going to stay with us and going to get worse. One of the greatest and most important things that the next president can do, and I hope the next president is Hillary Clinton, is to try to bring us together. Jim McConnell, Professor Reich, are you afraid for the country? Well, Jim, I've got to tell you, and this is a good question to come on the backs of the other. I remember 1968. In 1968, I was just getting out of college. And in 1968, the country really was splitting. I mean, if you remember, any of you remember 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The cities were burning. People were rioting. We had the Vietnam War that was claiming more and more lives, and it was escalating. We had in Chicago, I remember because I was passing through, we had riots. The Democratic Party literally came apart. Students were rioting in Chicago. Mayor Daley at the time was bringing in the National Guard. Chaos, pandemonium. And what was the result? Well, the result ultimately was Richard Nixon being elected. I left the country. I thought that was the end of it. But we came together and we healed some of those wounds. And I think we will do so again. What we're going through today is nowhere near as deep and as vicious and as angry as what we went through in 1968. And on that upbeat note, I want to welcome Karen Martin.
Hi.
Karen, hello.
Hello. Hug shake.
A hug shake. Karen Martin, I want to remind you, Karen is our resident expert. She is not only a resident expert here at the Goldman School, she is a national expert on the issues pertaining to race and criminal justice. Thank you for joining us, Karen.
My pleasure.
1 week before Election Day.
Yes.
But listen, I want to ask you about voter suppression.
Yes.
We've had a lot of people writing in about voter suppression. How big a problem is it, or is it likely to be?
I think it's quite big, and in particular, I am concerned about felon disenfranchisement.
Wait a minute, before you go on,
Yes.
let me just repeat that. Felon
Yes.
disenfranchisement.
So if you have a criminal conviction, specifically of a felony, then a lot of places make it so you can't vote. In fact, only 2 states allow you to vote.
What are the 2 states that allow felons to vote?
That allow you to vote with no restrictions: Vermont and Maine.
Vermont and Maine.
That's right.
So up there in the corner.
Close to Canada, it's like
And
spillover.
well, that sounds like it might have something to do with race. I mean, am I being naive about that?
No, I think you might be being quite realistic. The history of criminal justice in this system, in our country, quite frankly, has a lot to do with race. And I think that felon disenfranchisement laws specifically, is a carryover from poll tax and voter suppression of black people right after the end of slavery, and it's kind of part of the tradition. So yes, it's definitely related to race. At the same time, it's not just black people or Latino people. I think the rate is something like 1 out of every 56 people is no right to vote because of a conviction.
1 out of 56. Now, Terry McAuliffe in Virginia has tried to end the restriction on felons voting. Did he get anywhere?
He got somewhere, and then the state Supreme Court said that you can't do that. You can't have a general law, that you have to take each case individually. And so now he's actually successfully pursued thousands of re-enfranchisement cases, just one at a time.
But how about public opinion? I mean, isn't it the case that if you've already paid your debt to society, you've already been to prison, if you pay the debt to society from your crime, shouldn't you be allowed to vote? Doesn't that mean you've been reinstated in some way?
Yes, you would think. But many states, if you're for example, in California, if you're in prison or on parole, then you have no right to vote. But once you're done with those, then you can vote. So it depends a lot by state. I think there's something like 12 states where if you're in prison, probation, parole, and you've completed your sentence, still no right to vote if you have a felony conviction. And so it depends on states. Some states have, if you're actually actively being punished, then no, you can't vote. But if you're done, then yes, you can.
And public opinion on this, is it as extreme as the states, or?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question. I don't know. I think that there's still a lot of stigma around having a criminal history. I think there's a lot of fear about criminals and crime, and violent crime in particular. I think most importantly, it gets used as a kind of horrible political football, always has in this country. And so I think when people are confronted with the reality that we are depriving a lot of people of the right to vote because of something they did in the past, which of course how they got in the criminal justice system in the first place is also kind of flawed.
Well, I want to get to that because of the people who are felons,
yes.
What percentage of black men, for example, have a felony conviction?
I brought notes today because there are some very important numbers.
Okay.
For example, 1 in every 13 African Americans has lost the right to vote.
1 out of 13, not only men, we're talking about African Americans has
altogether.
Lost the right to vote because of felony conviction.
Because of felony conviction. And I want to remind you and everybody else that we have a massive carceral state. So just to put this into context, right now we have 2.2 million people in prison or jail, but 7 million people under some type of supervision, probation, parole, something like that. That's huge. And if you think about the world, so the rate per 100,000 in the world of people in prison is 150. So like England, typically around 150. About half the country's at 150. United States, do you want to guess what our rate per 100,000 is?
I do. Per 100,000, I don't know. I have no idea.
For everybody, it's like 600 or 700, depending on how you count.
So does that make us the highest incarceration nation?
Yes.
Among all advanced nations?
Yeah, and it depends on exactly who you compare us to, but yes, in general. So the rate, so you guessed, so it's like 600 or 700 for everybody. For white men, it's like 400, 500. For Latino, per 100,000. For Latino, so men of Hispanic descent, about 1,000. Want to guess what it is for black men? Rate per 100,000?
1,500?
Higher. More than 2,000. By some estimates, 2,700.
Per 100,000?
Per 100,000.
Wow.
So given all that, yes.
So any proper discussion of voter suppression of African Americans and Latinos in this country needs to consider not just the issue of gerrymandering and voter IDs and polls, but also this issue of disenfranchising essentially a big portion of the African American and Latino populations because of this rule against felons ever voting.
Ever. And one of my research topics is criminal justice debt. So people have some contact with their criminal justice system. They have to pay fines, fees, restitution, surcharges, kind of a crazy quilt of all different types of things you have to pay. And up around 30 states, you can't vote until you've completely paid your debt. So if you owe the state some money because of that, you can't vote in 30 states.
So quite apart from the issue of felony,
completely separate from felony.
If you just basically you have been stuck. When we talked before, you gave some chilling accounts of people who were put in jail, pre-detention, before trial,
Yeah.
pre-trial detention, and then were handed the bill.
Yes.
For being arrested and
Yes.
being put in jail.
Yes.
And if those people can't pay that bill, they cannot vote.
Correct. In about 30 states. And some, I think
30 states.
30 states,
Karen,
I
there's
know.
a lot of states here.
It is, and then about half of those it's provisional. So some you can't vote no matter what. And some, it's like if you stay up on your payments, if you don't fall behind, you may be in debt, but if you're continuing making payments, then you can vote. So 17 states, it's...
So I want to get this straight, and I want people who are watching to get this straight. 17 states. If I am arrested, I'm not convicted, I'm put in jail, I'm handed a bill for being in jail, I can't pay that bill, then I can't vote.
Something like that happens,
Holy
yes.
cow.
Something like that. I mean, it depends a lot. Most places we're talking about people who have been convicted of something, but it could be a misdemeanor something, not necessarily felony something.
And even if somebody is convicted of a felony,
Mm-hmm.
How many of those felonies are nonviolent, are drug-related?
There is a big swath. Violent felonies are, I'd say, like a third of the cases that are of people who are actually incarcerated. But there's a lot of different types of crime in this country. So there's a lot of immigration crimes. We decided to criminalize immigration in this country. There's a lot of nonviolent drug offenses. There's a lot of other types of offenses. Owning a firearm if you're a convicted felon. So you're not actually doing anything else, but we decided that as a felon you're not allowed to have a firearm. And so understanding the breakdown of what counts as violent versus non-violent, yes, we can say by the statistics, but when you ask people, like if somebody example of a crime, I was with my friend and he did something violent, that person can be convicted of a violent crime in a lot of places. So even if we call something violent, did the person actually individually commit an act of violence? It really depends.
But we have reason, or do we have reason to believe that if you are African American or Latino, you are more likely to go to jail or have a felony conviction for a nonviolent offense of the same sort that a white person is not likely to go to jail
You don't even
for.
need to qualify that by offense. Just across the board, at every stage in the criminal justice process, there are serious racial disparities. Everything from who gets a plea bargain that's more friendly or more lenient, and who doesn't. Who's even just arrested? Who is stopped and frisked? Who's searched? Even though the rates of contraband, usually white people end up having higher rates of contraband if they're searched. Black and Latino people are searched much more often, and so at every step of the way.
So, Karen, given all of these disparities, and also given that a lot of black people and also Latinos, when they see police officers, are a little bit nervous. If the Republicans start monitoring these voting places, and they wear outfits that look official in some ways, or even if there are Justice Department people there with official-looking badges and so on, could that be itself intimidating?
I think absolutely, and there are some jurisdictions that have intentionally moved the polling place into law enforcement offices, so into the sheriff's office is now the polling place. I posit that is...
Who is doing that?
I can't remember exactly where, but I definitely read recently that has happened. So yes, I think intimidation takes many different forms. And I think if you think about how many people get caught up in, for example, criminal justice debt, and that's from misdemeanors, people have outstanding warrants because they haven't paid child support or something else, then people definitely have a fear of any interaction with law enforcement. So if there's some presence of law enforcement, then that is absolutely going to help keep some people away from voting.
Because New Jersey, for example, New Jersey obviously is not a southern state, but it's under court order to avoid what was going on for years, and that is Republicans were under the Republican Party officially rounding up people to be poll watchers, quote unquote, and have official, kind of official looking poll watching gear on that might be quite intimidating.
Yeah, and then you add to that just that, a lot of places there's really long lines. A lot of places people don't get time off from work. A lot of people are struggling with childcare, transportation, et cetera, et cetera. So I think any little thing that makes it less likely for some person to vote is a problem.
So this is we're talking about a terrain that is not voter ID.
Right.
That is not about gerrymandering, that is not about all the ways in which we have come to think about voter suppression. This is a huge other issue that we're not talking about.
Exactly, a huge other issue. which I think is quite a pivotal issue.
But in 2008, was it because of Barack Obama that many, notwithstanding all of this,
Right.
We had a very significant portion of African Americans actually voting?
I think so. I think people were excited. They were ready to go and have their voices heard. Absolutely.
All right. At that word excitement, are they going to be as excited about Hillary Clinton?
Some of them, absolutely.
Yeah.
Some of them will. Some of them less so.
Well, obviously,
But
it's not fair to you to speak for all African Americans, but the question that is in many people's minds is the enthusiasm gap. I mean,
Yeah.
we saw some polls this morning that suggest that that Donald Trump's supporters are more enthusiastic than Hillary Clinton's supporters.
Yeah, I question the enthusiasm gap because you can still unenthusiastically vote.
Right.
I don't care how much you're yelling and smiling and whatever when you're checking your chat.
Well, you can unenthusiastically vote, but if you are an African American or a Latino and you have all of this other all of the things that we're talking about today, that could maybe be a tipping point for you, couldn't it?
It could be. It could. I think there's also the fear of the other candidate that could produce some momentum and enthusiasm to try to overcome all of those hurdles, even with even more urgency.
Well, I didn't want to stop you. You had a couple of other things you wanted to share with us.
I think that question.
Oh, okay, goody.
Do you want to take a question? I don't want to.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, in my home state of Virginia and in Florida, we're at about 20% of African American men cannot vote. 1 in 5.
In Virginia and Florida.
And a
Now,
couple
Virginia is a key state. Florida is absolutely is critical in this election. 1 out of 5 African American men in Florida cannot vote.
In Virginia, yeah.
Because and both Virginia
Because
and Florida,
of Virginia.
because of the felony.
Yep.
We have a question here from Alexandra Silva. Are Native Americans also more likely to be disenfranchised? I'm thinking about the Dakota Access Pipeline protesters.
I'm not really up on the issues facing specifically Native American voters, especially because of all of the intricacies of people who live on tribal land and people who don't, and jurisdiction, and I'm not an expert on that.
Well,
but I would imagine this kind of the same incentives are in place to suppress certain votes, and I don't know if you saw the fold out in the New York Times today, but it was very interesting because some of the highest rates of Democratic support are in the places with the highest Native American populations. So I would not be surprised if there are similar incentives in place to try to suppress certain votes.
Well, I know, because there was a report a few years ago that with regard to Native Americans, it's difficult for them to get because they live in very, very rural areas. It's difficult for some to get to voting places, and that has been a perennial problem. And what worries me is that every time we have an election, people recognize these problems, and then we do nothing about them until the next election. Okay, back to your. Shall we go back to your?
Let's see. What else can I tell you? Oh, one of the things that I think is important to keep in mind is that for African American men who were born in 2001, they have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in the course of their lifetimes.
Born in 2001. In other words, their chance is higher going to the prison in their lifetimes than African American men born in the 60s or 70s or 50s. Now, is that because of the trend line? Is that because of?
That's because we're incarcerated. I mean, it is now starting to plateau, if not decrease, depending again on how you count in federal versus state and different types of offenses. But given that we are incarcerating so many more people compared to the rest of the world, to have any given demographic have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison in the course of their lifetimes is completely insane.
Karen, we've talked about this before, but I want to go back to it. The prison industrial complex, people refer to as the sort of political power that comes, particularly in rural areas where there are not that many jobs except in prisons. And the prisons have kind of substituted in some way for the military industrial complex in certain places as the source of jobs, and therefore have a lot of power. Very hard to decriminalize and get people out of prison if you've got so many jobs depending on those prisons. In your research, have you come across anything to validate that concern?
There is a really interesting tension between efforts to try to get prisons to locate in rural areas. For example, in the eastern and southern swath of California, there used to be all agriculture and manufacturing, and now those industries have depleted, and so there's more prisons are built in those areas. But it's actually interesting because I believe it was the Sentencing Project did a report and found that rural location of prisons doesn't actually generate all of the economic benefits that you might think it does. It's very effective political rhetoric, but in the end, it still kind of sucks resources out of the community without giving many back.
So the outlook, if you're looking at the future, and
Yeah.
you say 1 out of 3 African American boys born today is going to statistically spend
right.
some time in prison. I mean, that's outrageous.
Yes.
We can't sustain that.
No.
And that goes way beyond voting suppression. That goes to the future chances of a huge portion of our population. Do you think that's going to turn around? And if it, what's going to turn that around?
Well, I do think that there is, people know what mass incarceration is. There's been a lot of advocacy, a lot of movement, good books, good films coming out that explain the situation. So I think a lot of people now can articulate that perhaps mass incarceration is not the best idea for anybody. And I think that realizing the cost of the system, both the actual literally financial cost, but also the social cost, people are starting to understand that we may not be getting what we think we're getting. It's not like prisons work, now there's no more crime because we've locked up all the bad people. That's not how it works.
Well, it looked for a moment as if there was going to be some sort of bipartisan support for a major crime reform bill that would reduce or eliminate 3 strikes you're out, that would actually reduce sentencing guidelines or change them, and then that seems to have fallen apart.
I'm still hopeful. I think there's a lot of bipartisan support for issues like unfair taxation, which is essentially some of the stuff that I'm finding. Essentially, it's taxing without calling it a tax.
But not so much bipartisan support for alleviating voter suppression.
Not so much. I think there's even a difference in how you would define voter suppression.
Yes, yes. Well, on that positive note.
Yes.
One of the things I try to do in this half hour we have is to try to at least end on a positive note.
Okay.
I do, in my experience at least, this country does behave sensibly. I mean, when people ask me, are we really going to have Donald Trump as our president after next Tuesday, or at least vote next Tuesday, I say no, because looking at the history of this country, and I'm getting old enough to look at the history of the country and to have actually experienced part of the history, I think people are just more sensible. When it comes to absolutely committing oneself and thinking about one's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, you just don't want to do anything that jeopardizes their future.
Yeah.
So I continue to be positive, as I am about race relations. I mean, when you think about how far we've come, now granted, we haven't come, and on issues that you are working on, we haven't come nearly as far as we should have. In fact, in certain respects, we're going backwards. But I like to think that progress is being made. Do you share my view of progress?
I share large components of your view of progress, yes.
I'm not forcing you to say
No,
that.
you're not at all. Of my own will, I say that I definitely affirm and share.
Well, before we close, what aspects of my view of progress do you share?
I share I think there is progress in terms of race relations. I think that it's a very big deal and very important people can actually articulate some of these issues. I think it's much different to be stuck in an era where you don't either you don't talk about it, or it's always just dog whistle politics and coded language. To be able to say that white supremacy is a thing, or to be able to say that felon disenfranchisement is actually about race, just being able to say those things and for people to understand what you're talking about and to not dismiss it outright is really, I think that's a huge sign of progress. And so I like to keep hope alive on that front.
Let's keep hope alive.
Okay.
And on that, let's keep hope alive. Please, next Tuesday, do keep hope alive. Vote, and vote in a way that is good for this country. We'll see you next Tuesday on Election Day for our Election Day special. Bye-bye.